Hi, everyone, and welcome to this presentation of Black Vaqueros. My name is Professor Javier Gonzalez-Meeks, and let me start our slide, start sharing. I thought it was a little appropriate to begin with a song from a Western, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. I actually saw it when I was in my 20s at a friend's house. But anyway, that's a long story. So welcome again. I'm Professor Javier Gonzalez-Meeks. We got ourselves into the mind frame, with the little Western music in the background. I want to say, just reflect before we begin. Now, what comes to mind when we think about the Wild West? What comes to mind when we think about cowboys? What's the first image or first thought that we usually have when we think about cowboys and the Wild West? Let's kind of just let that just sit for a little bit. You don't have to answer, it's rhetorical, just something to think about. And if you're like most people, like me too, you usually think of, Westerns like, Sam Elliott or John Wayne or Clint Eastwood, right? I mean, I used a song from one of Clint Eastwood's movies, The Good and Bad and the Ugly. And what we have is this depiction of the cowboy, right? This rugged individual. This represents the American exceptionalism. The cowboy represents the U.S., right? Yeah, expansion, taming the Wild West, bringing industry, bringing civilization, right? Not scared of anyone, and will do anything for his country, will do anything for those that he sees as need protecting, right? He'll push off invaders like those Native Americans, like, how dare you want to live in your land, right? Or Mexicans, Californians, like, what are you guys doing here? So that is the mindset that we have usually when we think of cowboys, or usually when I think of cowboys, or the Wild West. And the reality is, when we look at the history of cowboys, a lot of them cowboys were black. The cowboys were black. And we'll look at the etymology of the word cowboy in a little bit. But according to some historians, out of 4 cowboys were black. Some historians say the number is actually higher, 1/3, mainly because a lot of the slave masters didn't want to pay taxes on census of their slaves. So they'll just tell a large group, like, hey, you know what? Why don't you go take the cattle out while the census guy comes? That way I can only pay, the census on the house slaves and not the slave hands that are working in the on the ranches. So some scholars believe that it could be a lot higher, to like 1/3 of cowboys were black. And so something to think about is, when did this start? When did the process of being a cowboy or a vaquero, right, start? And vaquero is a Spanish word. So Spanish word for what is a cow hand, or someone that handles cow and cattle. And I'll get to that, the wordplay in a little bit. But just kind of a little historical background. I am a historian, and just want to look at when kind of the cattle raising, cattle farming, started. And it happened in the late 1500s in colonial Spanish America and North America. And we have to say it starts I would say, even close to the mid 1600s. I mean, 1521, you have the sack of Tenochtitlan. Around the 1560s, 1540s, you have small Spanish conquistadors exploring. And some of you, if you attended my last presentation on Black conquistadores, talked a little bit about that. They making their way into New Mexico, to Santa Fe, and going into like the southeast, going to Florida, and going into Colorado. So what we have is a slow process of exploring, but there's not a large population in this in our present day American Southwest at this time. What we do have about the late 1800s is right around the time period where Mexico gained its independence from Spain, and Mexico is trying to entice, try to get people to move out from the altiplano, from like the central part of Mexico and into the southwest to populate it. Because right now you have the French and English, and you have those pesky Russians coming and colonizing North America. So you need to fill your territory with bodies so you can claim it. So we started to see cattle raising become very popular in the late 1800s. And what we're going to see is the Mexican government, the newly formed Mexican government, is going to encourage US Americans, especially in the South, this southern state's very agricultural, in trying to bring a lot of US Americans to immigrate into Mexico. They had to convert to Catholicism, and to become Mexican citizens, right? They weren't U.S. citizens anymore, and a lot of them did. However, Mexico was banned slavery. There was no slavery in Mexico. However, the Mexican government allowed Southern agricultural immigrants to bring their own slaves. They just couldn't spread slavery. They could bring their slaves, but they couldn't, enhance the practice of the institution of slavery. Another reason why the Mexican government was doing this was to whiten the population of Mexico. Mexico itself, had a large, African heritage, a large indigenous population, a lot of interracial marriages. And so for a lot of the former colonial elite that are now in charge of the government, they wanted to, maintain their European whiteness. So by bringing over, white Americans, that was another way to whiten the Mexican population. And it's kind of ironic, there was a large influx of US Americans that were coming into Mexico, and Mexico actually banned US Americans from coming to Mexico. Kind of the irony, right? Like we were talking about a wall, and it's like a couple of miles from where we live in San Diego. But Mexico, prohibiting US immigration because it was just way too much. They were afraid that what would happen and what did happen would be kind of a revolution, the Texas independence, and then the US invasion of Mexico and the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. All of that, they'll lead to less territory for Mexico. And so what we see is within Mexico, losing all land, but what we have is within Texas itself, going from a Spanish colony to a Mexican state to independence to a U.S. State to then a Confederate state, and then back again to a Union state, is the use of cowhands, individuals to help them with the cattle. At this time, there wasn't a transcontinental railroad. Railroads are barely being produced and put in, so you needed individuals that could control and manage the cattle. And so when the Texas joins the Confederacy for the Civil War, a lot of Texans, Anglo-Texans, because there's also Mexican Tejanos as well that also fought in the Confederacy as well, but that's a different story. These white Texans, joined the Confederacy. A lot of the fighting of the Civil War didn't happen a lot in Texas, but they went and still joined their compatriots during the battles, and they left behind their slaves to look after their ranches, to look after the cattle. And then with the Emancipation Proclamation and a lot of the slaves, left, or they'll just leave in general during the height of battle. No one's really looking like, well, where's everybody? They'll take off, run away, go up north. So when the Texas ranchers came back, their cattle were running everywhere. There's no barbed wire to kind of keep the cattle in. So they now needed to, during the Reconstruction period, to hire paid labor, black labor. And a lot of them were their former slaves. So now they hired back their former slaves, not hired back, they hired their former slaves who had the practice, the skills, right, of managing the cattle, of knowing the terrain, of dealing with indigenous groups that really don't want them there at all. But it makes sense. That's a different story. And so we have these Black slaves, now free labor, that have the skills. They have the skills to offer their roping and all this during the cattle trails throughout Texas, trying to make their way up north to like Missouri and stuff like that, to their final destination where they'll be processed. So a lot of these, and it wasn't just all Blacks, you also have white cowhands too. But Blacks, unfortunately, through racist rhetoric, they were called boys. And cowboy was their kind of derogatory term that was given to them by a lot of the white handlers, the white ranchers. You have your white cowhand, and then you have your Black cowboy. And so what we have is, despite the negative use of the word cowboy, we're going to see how these Black cowboys were very successful in what they did. We're going to look at some examples of very prominent figures that are quite amazing during this period as well. So you can see in the map right here the different cattle trails that were going from Texas, moving on up into like Missouri, to Nebraska, to Wyoming. A lot of it during this process, because post-Civil War, the US government can now focus on that transcontinental railroad coming from California, going east, going from New York, going west. And so with that being built, going east and west, these cattle trails are trying to intersect, kind of meet in the middle. So those trains can load up the cattle and take them to like New York, take them to San Francisco. And a lot of Black cowboys faced a lot of discrimination when they left Texas. Depending on what town they went into, they weren't allowed to eat, they weren't allowed to stay in certain hotels. And so, what we see are those Jim Crow laws, racial segregation already kind of being put into place, but that was already established with a lot of the Black codes during the Reconstruction period anyway. Not justifying it, but what we see is the racial discrimination, not allowing these Black cowboys to dine at a diner or to stay at a certain hotel. A lot of them had to eat outside or stay outside. Despite that, a lot of Black cowboys, developed a strong camaraderie with the white cowhands. Here we have a excerpt from a letter from one cowboy, Nat Love. We'll talk about Nat Love in a second. And here in his autobiography that he wrote years after his exploits, a braver, truer set of men never lived than these wild sons of the plains, whose home was in the saddle and their couch Mother Earth. With the sky for a covering, they were always ready to share their blanket and their last ration with a less fortunate fellow companion, and always assisted each other in the many trying situations that were continually coming up in a cowboy's life. So what we kind of get a description here is a feeling of freedom for Nat Love, right? A freedom of, he's not confined. He has like Mother Earth to kind of just surround him. And it didn't matter, Black or white, the fellow cowhands, cowboys are going to share whatever meal, because they have to work together. They're working together against the elements, against very hostile Native Americans that do not want them to bring their cattle through their land, and through poachers, through wild animals. So you have and all the Native Americans and the environment isn't going to care, like, I'm just going to pick on the Black cowboy, not the white cowboy. That's not going to happen. So you need that camaraderie, and that camaraderie gets very strong as these cattle trains go from Texas and move up north. So yes, a lot of the black cowboys, faced a lot of discrimination in a lot of the cities they went into, but out in the open range, they were one and the same. Not true equality. I mean, given that they're being called cowboys, but what we have is a sense of somewhat freedom, right? So not true equality, but a sense of respect in a way. So who was Nat Love? Nat Love was born into slavery. As he grew older, about the year about 10 to almost 16 years of age, he was able to make his own money. He was a cowhand. And then he used those skills and moved to Texas. And then sharpened his skills as a cowhand, cowboy through the Texas panhandle. So those cattle trains, he worked on all of those. He would do that for several years until basically the steam engine trains, they kind of took away, eventually that industrial revolution will take away the need for these cattle trains. So what was a very kind of lucrative job for a lot of people, men of color, a lot of blacks that didn't want to be porters or house servants in a post-Civil War era. Being a cowboy provided you a lot of freedom. But once the steam engine started getting more popular, what we see is the cowboys now kind of losing their that job. There was no need for it anymore. That skill was no longer needed. So Nat Love would work as a porter, and he would tell, porter is basically someone that carries your bags to the different train car, basically. And so he regales everybody with his stories, and eventually he'll have it written down. And for some historians, they view it like, well, he's maybe it's a little exaggerated, but within the stories of Nat Love, he talks about how not only was he a very skilled cowhand, that he was able to do these competitions, rodeo competitions, right? They'll jump and tie up a cow or cattle, buck on different bulls. Those were some of the fun sports that they did. And so he participated. He said he was so good. He was also an expert marksman. He earned this, he said he earned the nickname Deadwood Dick in the city of Deadwood because of every single competition he went into, he won. And so he earned that title, Deadwood Dick. Some historians, challenge that. They're like, well, there was a dime store novelist who, also talked about a Deadwood Dick, but no, was it Nat Love? Was it not? Are his stories like, it's blown up out of proportion, but who cares? What we have here is a lot of the experiences that Nat Love dealt with. We kind of get a glimpse of the mindset of Nat Love of working on those cattle trains, right? Of a freed black man, working as a cowboy, which sounds very interesting. And there is a really interesting movie. It's not historically accurate at all, but it's an amazing movie called The Harder They Fall. And as you can see right here at the bottom, Jonathan Majors plays Nat Love. It's a different story. The first 5 minutes are kind of like, but after that, the story is really great if you get a chance to watch that on Netflix. And that's something about what cowboys are. Cowboys are not just cowboys, but are people that are successful in taming, cows and horses and all of those kind of rodeo kind of games. Those are some of the jobs of the cowboy, right? Of the cowhand, of the vaquero. And so one woman that we have is a very fascinating, Joanna July, a black Seminole. Her and her family were part of that Trail of Tears, made their way into Oklahoma right when the Civil War is about to start. A lot of the black Seminoles were afraid that they'll be taken into slavery because of the color of their skin. So they went into Mexico. Remember, there's no slavery in Mexico. And they established a small little city, Nacimiento de los Negros, right? It's like a black town, and still celebrate today a lot of their heritage. And so here we have Joanna July, Black Seminole, and a lot of her, family living here in Mexico. And it won't be until a couple of years after the Civil War that a lot of the U.S. Rangers, are trying to scout out the area, so they need help. So they start to recruit a lot of the Black Seminoles that are in Nacimiento de los Negros and trying to bring them back. Say, hey, no, they don't want to stay in Mexico. Come back to the United States. We're fun. And so what we have is Joanna July, following with her family, coming back into the United States, helping out U.S. Rangers, learn the area, understand cattle trails and stuff like that. But one thing that she was really good at, as you can see in the last PowerPoint, was how uniquely she was able to tame horses. Instead of just kind of jumping on the horse and just riding it out as it starts to buck you and throws you off and you can potentially break your neck, she would kind of multitask. She'll get a basket of her clothes, right? And she'll take the horse and she'll go out to the river. So she's washing her clothes, she has her horse there, and then she'll lead the horse into the river until the horse is, about, up to its neck, not drowning, but like up to its neck. And she'll sit on him. And that will cause the horse to start bucking, but the horse is a little nervous. It's in water. So eventually, because of the water, the horse is like, do I want to drown or do I want to let the person just ride on my back? And so the horse will say, I'll just let the person ride on my back. And so that is how Joanna July would tame horses, multitasking, taking a horse down with her laundry. So she's washing her clothes in the river and then taming horses by sitting on them in the high river to eventually calm them, tame them, to break them, as that was her specialty. And so Joanna July, a very early cowboy, right, cowhand, vaquero, who was able to help out U.S. Rangers understand the territory, scout out areas that they were unfamiliar with, and also to tame wild horses. And we have another fascinating figure in our vaquero story of cowboys and cowhands, Kathy Williams. Now, born to enslaved parents, and eventually what she'll do is during the Civil War, she will join the Union Army for people of color under a name called William Kathy. They're kind of ingenious. She just used her last name and took out the S. William Kathy, and she cross-dressed, right? There was medical examinations, but they didn't have to do a full body examination. So she passed. She was allowed to continue to fight as a male soldier. They never checked her. Eventually, she'll catch smallpox, and she'll eventually be honorably discharged when a surgeon, checking her out, realizes oh wait, you're a lady. And so they would have to tell her commanding officer, hey, you have a female here, she's not supposed to be in the Union Army. And so she'll be honorably discharged in 1868, even though she, fought in different campaigns with her compatriots during the Civil War. After, she'll join the Buffalo Soldiers, an all-black regiment, and she will fight with them in different battles, and she would eventually settle down after that. And she had an abusive husband that she left, and eventually, as she got older and after her second marriage, she would settle down and petition for a military pension. And it sounds kind of out there, but there were a lot of women that fought in the U.S. Revolutionary War that dressed as men. Deborah Sampson is one of them, who actually received a military pension. And so this wasn't unheard of. She knew this, and she requested for one. It was denied. And it was denied after she was diagnosed, I forgot with what illness, and she'll pass away. So, despite that, here we have a young lady, who fought with the Union Army, fought with the Buffalo Soldiers. And the Buffalo Soldiers, what their job was to do was in to work in a lot of the Indian territories, the unoccupied areas of the Midwest, as basically park rangers. We'll think of park rangers, making sure there weren't timber thieves, people just chopping down wood and taking it, making sure there was no poachers, making sure that there wasn't any illegal activities and stuff going on in the different areas that they were patrolling. So here we have, someone else, Kathy Williams, joining the Buffalo Soldiers, another kind of group of cowboys that are, ensuring the safety and taming that Wild West. And probably my favorite individual is this gentleman, Bass Reeves. One, not just because of his impressive mustache, just because of what he had accomplished. Bass Reeves, also born into slavery. He would also become the first U.S. deputy marshal west of Mississippi. He controlled a large territory because it was unincorporated. Basically, it wasn't an official state, specifically in Oklahoma yet. So he had a large territory that he was able to patrol and had a lot of jurisdiction when he was a deputy. And we'll talk a little bit about his accolades. When the Civil War broke out, a lot, and since he was from Arkansas, a lot of slave masters would take their slaves with them to be kind of like their servants and kind of like, to ensure that they're all safe and stuff like that. Well, we don't know exactly what happened. The story goes as there was a confrontation between Bass Reeves and his master over a card game. And Bass Reeves just really just nailed it to his master and took off, ran away. When he ran away, he fled into the Oklahoma territory. And there he took refuge with the Seminole, Cherokee Creek indigenous groups. Now, these are the indigenous groups that are from the Southeast and were part of that Trail of Tears from Andrew Jackson that were stolen from their homes and made to relocate to Oklahoma. So Bass Reeves took refuge with these indigenous groups. They're, learning their customs, language, tracking skills. So here he is, he's learning. And that's one thing about, another thing about him being a slave, he was never learned to read or write. He never had that opportunity to read and write, but he had phenomenal tracking skills, was able to understand different languages, was able to communicate with different groups of people, and also was an expert a marksman. He was ambidextrous, so he can use both hands, and he'll walk around with his guns butt out. So for a quick draw, he was really good, really good shot, literally. And so eventually, because he'll return back after the Civil War to Arkansas, he'll buy a farm, he'll marry, he'll have about 10 kids. It's like, a lot. I'm struggling with 2. And so what we have is the knowledge that he knew of the territory, especially his interactions with the indigenous groups in that area, made him well liked by the deputy marshal, by the court in that area where they deputized him. And then he was able to, use his skills as a lawman, going out into the territorial states of Oklahoma to Arkansas, different areas, patrolling for a lot of fugitives. And his posse or his group that he usually took with him was a it could be like a cook to help him cook, Native American posse man, someone to accompany him. And a lot of his travels would be like an 800-mile round trip, right? And so it was it was arduous, but he knew the area, he knew the territory, and he wasn't just walking around. He was a master of disguise. He'll dress up as a beggar, he'll dress up as a woman, he'll do whatever he needed to do to catch the person he needed. One time he was looking for a horse thief. He stood in a bush for like 4 days just waiting for that horse thief and eventually caught him just disguised as a bush. And eventually that horse thief came by, captured him. Another story was two brothers, fugitives, were out hiding. They went to hide with their mom's house, and Bass Reeves disguised himself as a beggar, as someone that was also fighting, fleeing the law kind of deal. And he talked about his exploits. The mom was like, ooh, I know some people that can help you out. Stay right here, young man. And she brings her two sons, and her two sons are sitting there with Bass Reeves. They're eating, they're talking, they're having a grand old time. They have so much food in his mom's house. They pass out asleep. When they're asleep, Bass Reeves handcuffs them, wakes them up in the morning, drags them out, and the mom is yelling, screaming at him for 8 miles as he drags these two out from their mom's house back to get his bounty, to return them to justice, to the courthouse. So there's a lot of fascinating things Bass Reeves has done. Some scholars argue that he was actually the figure that the creator of the Lone Ranger made up. And some scholars say, no, it can't be. But when you look at the characteristics of who the Lone Ranger was, right? Rode a white stallion, nice dresser. It sounds exactly like Bass Reeves when we read his stories, accolades, experts, marksman, travel with a Native American individual. The person Lone Ranger travels with, also a Native American with a very derogatory name. And so what we have, when you think about it, when you look at the Lone Ranger, his little black mask kind of like makes me think like blackface, basically, right? The writer that created the Lone Ranger, couldn't make at this time and place, a black hero, but he can make it a white hero and do like a little blackface. I don't know, put a little black mask on him. But Bass Reeves becomes the blueprint for who this character is, the Lone Ranger. And Bass Reeves would serve for about 35 years as a deputy. He brought in about 3,000 outlaws. He killed about 14 men. Not proud of it. He said never shot a man when it was not necessary for him to do so in the discharge to save his life. So he did it out of the safety of his own life in case his life was in danger. One of the hardest bounties he had to do was on his son. There was a warrant for his eldest son who murdered his own wife, and the marshal and the judge were nervous. They were like, they weren't sure to give it to Bass or not, and Bass Reeves, took the job, found his son, brought him in, and his son will serve time in prison and will eventually be released due to good behavior and stuff like that. But so no one was above the law for Bass Reeves. Even his own son, no one was above the law. And there's a lot of cool movies that are starting to come out about Bass Reeves. He's kind of been shown in different TV shows. There's an NBC TV show called it was Timeline or something like that, where they show Bass Reeves. It actually shows that story where Bass Reeves tricks those two brothers and handcuffs them and takes them in. The PBS movie series 80 Days Around the World, one of the episodes had Bass Reeves in it as well. There is rumors that HBO is going to make a miniseries on Bass Reeves narrated by none other than Morgan Freeman. And Bass Reeves does come into the movie as well. Harder They Fall. I forget the actor's name, but we have Bass Reeves also in that movie as well. So very fascinating gentleman. Eventually, when Oklahoma becomes a state, because he was Black, he couldn't serve as a deputy anymore. And so he would leave his position as a deputy and become a police officer, serving the rest of his life as a police officer for a local law enforcement area. And Bill Pickett, another fascinating cowboy, vaquero. And he was more with the rodeo tricks and stuff like that. Not so much like a Bass Reeves going out shooting. He was more just taming and bringing down cattle. And so he learned at a really young age how to ride, how to rope. And so he would perform tricks on the weekend. That was like his weekend job. And he became so good at it that he made more money, that he will start to go to like prize competitions. And one of his best ones that he was able to do was a bulldog or steer wrestling, right? You you ride on your horse, you jump on the steer and you wrestle it down, right? Like how you wrestle down the steer. Well, what he noticed was how dogs brought down the cattle. And a lot of the dogs would bite the lip of the cow or the cattle. And so he did that. Like, all right, why not? So he'll hook onto the horns, he'll go in for lip on lip and just bite the bull. The bull, obviously, the cattle will duck down and he'll just pin it down. So that was one of his techniques. He was very good at it. He actually did a show in Mexico that caused a big uproar because of a bullfighting competition. And there's a certain kind of performance to the bullfighting. It's very glamorous. It's very elegant. I mean, I know it's bullfighting and they're killing the bull, but that is what they're espousing. They're trying to do this very very elite type of battle, man versus beast, right? And so you have Bill Pickett. He went to one of them as a performer, and he did that. He just like bit the bull, dragged it down. They were like, "What are you doing? That's how you do. You're supposed to like tease the bull, like dance with the bull, and then go for the heart." But here you have Bill Pickett like, "No, this is how I'm going to do it." Jumps on it, grabs him down, pins him down. Like, "Yep, did it." So Bill Pickett, notorious for his steer wrestling. And what we have is a legacy of Bill Pickett. A lot of sadly, after into the 20th century, a lot of the rodeo competitions, didn't allow a lot of Black competitors in. A lot of them wouldn't allow them to compete, and if they did, they were booed or harassed. So a lot of rodeos, had their own kind of like their own people of color rodeos. And one of them is a long one. It's actually at 36 years, not 32 years. The Bill Pickett Invitational, right? And here's some examples of, and right there, the gentleman right there is doing the steer wrestling. He just has to go in for the lip and pull him down, right? And then, so, competitions. So the legacy, so we see a legacy still of Black cowboys. And we still see that racist ideology that keeps, Black cowboys from being depicted or invited into the mainstream, right? They're not in the, professional bull riding association. They have to create their own, right? It's like, look, if you look at Major League Baseball during the segregation period with the Negro Leagues, right? So it's kind of like that. Like they have to have their own kind of league, their own invitational. But what we see though is a very fascinating development. A lot of Black communities in Compton, Philadelphia, Chicago are re-embracing their cowboy heritage and showing like, hey, there's another way of dealing with your anger and your angst. And a lot of this happened especially during the Black Lives Matter movement after the George Floyd murder, protesting on horseback, right? That legacy of the Black cowboy, that legacy of the Black cowboy to, stand up for justice, to stand up against, the tyranny of white supremacy, right? To stand up to that exceptionalism, because, what is exceptional are the Black cowboys and what they have done and the tradition that they're continuing to do. So thank you. I'm going to pause this right now. If you have any questions, please let me know.